Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world today. I want to take the time to thank you for joining this TechStrong learning experience with Spot by NetApp. My name is Amanda, and I'd like to welcome you to our TechStrong learning program today. This session is being recorded and will be available afterward on demand. We also will send you a link to your inbox after the conclusion of today's program. We ask that you please send your questions to the Q&A panel on the right-hand side of your screen and join us in the chat by telling us where you are today. Feel free to let us know how the weather is today. It's rainy here for me. Share your experiences, your comments, and your understanding of the matter. We want to hear and engage with you. Resources panel on the left-hand side of your screen has several handouts available, and we also have a survey for you to share at the end of the program. Your feedback is invaluable to let us know how you like today's session. Finally, we have 2 attendees that will receive a $50 Amazon gift card after today's session, so be sure to send in your comments and questions or fill out the survey at the end to be eligible for that. Today's topic that we are kicking off is the Balancing Act, Mastering the Art of Cost-Efficient Cloud Performance for Engineers. It's going to be a great program, and today I'm joined by Sean Harris, Developer Relations and Technical Alliances Lead at Spot by NetApp, and Adam Richer at AWS. He is a Senior Optimization Solutions Architect. Thank you to both of you for joining us today. And Sean, would you like to get us started?
Perfect. Thank you, Amanda, for that intro. We appreciate it. Like Amanda said, I'm Sean Harris. I'm the CloudOps Developer Experience Manager and Alliance's Technical Lead inside the NetApp of the Office of the CTO, and I handle all aspects of our CloudOps portfolio. I'm joined today by Adam Richter from the AWS Optics team. Adam, go ahead and introduce yourself, and then we'll kick this off.
Yeah, hey everyone, Adam Richter here. I work on the Optics team where I work full-time in helping our customers run efficient workloads on AWS. Thanks, Sean.
And that's why we're here, is to talk about efficient workloads from an engineering perspective. I come from an engineering background. I've spent over 2 decades in the IT ops space, for doing everything from low-level help desk all the way up to running DevOps engineering teams and platform engineering teams. So the reason we're here today is to talk about cost-efficient cloud performance and how it relates to FinOps. FinOps is a hot topic right now because the cloud has really changed the way that we work. We see an exponentially increasing amount of data, but with that increase of data comes complexity of your infrastructure and all the resources it takes to manage that data and the cost. So in 2015, SpotInst was founded with the goal to help make the acquisition of EC2 Spot instances and excess capacity inside of AWS easier. That's really where we got our bread and butter. But in 2020, the world changed overnight. We were forced to shift operations from on-prem environments to the cloud as fast as possible because of the pandemic. After that, and it was around that time that NetApp acquired SpotInst and began really building out their CloudOps portfolio. Post-acquisition by NetApp, we have become the mainstay of the NetApp CloudOps portfolio, helping companies move and manage their cloud and non-cloud workloads with an entire portfolio of storage, CloudOps, observability, open source database tools built for this next generation of data management. And now we're bringing a unified management plane for the entire cloud operations solutions set combined with hybrid cloud so that we can give you the best in class storage and lean heavily on everybody's current favorite buzzwords, AI and machine learning, to make automation easy at scale. But what was the main benefit of going to the cloud? Was it always about reducing costs? I'll defer to Adam here in a minute, but from my aspect, it was never about cost. It's always been about the elasticity of the cloud. The cost always came secondary, but as we increase our workloads, as our infrastructure grows and our compute needs grow, that cost is going to grow with it. So it becomes on us as engineers to manage it. Adam, let me get your thoughts on this big question of the benefit of the cloud, and was it always about cost?
You're right. I think cost is only one element. I think the ability to scale and take the responsibility out of the hands of developers having to worry about managing infrastructure and just being able to build and truly deliver value to customers. I think was the main driving factor to getting folks going to the cloud. And I think, shifting the mentality, not always around just saving money, but about making money. Right. I think the example I usually use is, if I told you every dollar in cost you went up, your business made $2 more in revenue, would you be okay with that trade-off? And of course, every company would, right? That would be a good signal that our cost is going up. So it's not always just to reduce cost. We want to understand that cost in relation to how it's impacting, our business. So I think that's an important perspective to keep.
It really is. And I think we lose sight of that because as we talk about FinOps and driving cloud success, FinOps is a new buzzword, but it's no different than DevOps. DevOps was the combination of showing how our development and our product teams were essential to so many other aspects of cloud success, but also the business as a whole. And so on the left-hand side of this chart, we see all the different groups that we interact with, right? We see business teams, we see finance, we see security. All of these teams have roughly the same requirements. They have productivity requirements. They have profitability and allocation and best practices. Now, but for the initial journey into the cloud, a lot of that got forgotten as to how it impacts cloud engineering and development teams. Because we're being asked as practitioners to take those requirements on the left and move them into products that we're shipping on the right. Doesn't matter if you're doing e-commerce or customer portals or you're managing desktops. All of these things that you see on this far right-hand block are things that we have to take into account when we manage them. So what are some common challenges around FinOps and the idea of FinOps, right? The initial question is, how can we deliver faster? How can modernization efforts like containerization that take a long time, how can you help? How can you speed that up? How can we do more with the budgets, right? We've changed the acquisition model from having to go through a long life cycle where I go and ask for a server and storage, and then somebody provisions it. And when we run out, somebody has to go buy it. With the cloud, it's elastic. And so we're able to go and rapidly spin up new infrastructure, new storage, and be able to manage that and be able to use it at scale, shut it down, and then we no longer have to pay for it. So we really changed that acquisition model. And then how can we deliver a better customer experience? But the biggest question is, how can we be more responsive to the business and the people that we work with? And that starts with identifying at first, right? When we talk about buy-in, we look at what are our goals when it comes to FinOps and using that. And we start with efficiency. And so efficiency, and Adam, I'll let you ping in on this. Efficiency is never about the dollars and cents. It's about how we're using, what does it cost to get a server? When you buy a server, that's a sunk cost, and you're going to amortize it over a certain time of year or a certain period of time, but you want to make sure that you're getting the most efficient use out of it. And if I'm standing up the biggest infrastructure in the cloud, am I using that infrastructure efficiency? And so, Adam, from the AWS Optics perspective, when it comes to efficiency, how do you define efficiency?
So efficiency for me is getting the most value out of the resources that you have deployed. And I want to see, at least the customers that I work with, ensure that the instances they have running are being fully used, as an example. It pains me to see idle resources that somebody has deployed that have been abandoned or forgotten about from a prior project, or a server that maybe somebody lifted and shifted and it's now double the size that it needs to be. Where in the cloud, you have the flexibility of seeing those metrics and downsizing it to, something smaller. Really, it's integrating a cost-aware culture into the company that now cost can become a part of our design decisions, becomes part of the constraints that we factor in when we are building or migrating workloads, into the cloud. So I think keeping that lens is extremely important for efficiency.
I agree. And working on the optics team and being part of what AWS has built into, they've made one of the pillars of the well-architected framework of FinOps, just around FinOps and using your infrastructure efficiently. When we started seeing this wholesale shift to the cloud, where people were just forklifting their workloads from an on-prem server to AWS, when they were provisioning the servers, I know from my experience, we just go pick the server that most closely matched whatever we were working on. What kind of efficiency gains do you see when you show people, like, how do you see that? Let me rephrase this. Do you see a reduction in infrastructure spread and waste, right? And we'll call waste that unused resources. Do you see that people are getting more dialed into what efficiency means for their workloads as they forklift those workloads into AWS, or are they pretty much staying the same?
I do. I think there's two perspectives that people take when moving workloads to the cloud. One is the lift and shift mentality, and I think that's great for speed, right? You can just migrate things over, keep a comparable size, get the workload running in the cloud pretty quickly, and then you get that scalability and agility, and you move forward. That's not generally the most cost efficient, though, because oftentimes teams lack visibility in their own environment. When you move to the cloud, AWS, for example, we have CloudTrail logs, CloudWatch, monitoring of your resources, and a variety of other services you can turn on to get that visibility. And I think that unlocks the ability to make better decisions. You can now see how well those resources are being utilized, and you can decide if that server that you picked is still the right fit. Whereas when it was on-prem, you own the server. Like you said, you amortize it. It's not going anywhere, whether it's double the size that you need. There's no necessarily an initiative to downsize it or to get rid of it, because it would be more complex to purchase another server that's half the size potentially, right? Whereas in the cloud now, you can, in a maintenance window, schedule to resize that instance or potentially modernize it, move it to something that's maybe even more cost effective or more performant. So I think it unlocks the ability to be more efficient in that sense.
In that lift and shift model, when do you start realizing, or when do you typically see customers start to realize, hey man, we need to get more, we've moved this workload, we need to get more efficient? When do you start seeing those efforts really? Do you see that day one or day two, or do you see it a little bit farther down the road after they've gotten more stable?
Yeah, and in the mindset kind of pillar here that I call optimize, I think that's the time when you want to consider it. Do we want to optimize this workload on the front end before we bring it in? Like, we want to spend that extra cycle evaluating what the right services are, right? It might not even make sense to use the same structure that you had, the same design that you had. There might be options to go to serverless technologies. So I think it's important to think about that as much as possible on the front end. Although I see a fair amount of customers just move it over for speed and then optimize it later. And I would say the barrier to change then is a lot harder, especially if it's production, right? Because once it's running in production, we're now serving customers, we're getting business value. There's risk that comes associated with changing anything in that environment. And it becomes a slightly bigger barrier to go after those savings and do some of those changes after the fact. So I guess if I could provide a piece of recommendation here, would be spend that little bit of extra time on the front end looking for the modernization and testing as well in the cloud what may be a better fit, because it will lead you on a trajectory of running a more efficient workload for the long haul, rather than carrying in kind of that extra cost and just kind of reproducing the same thing that you had. So that's the two mentalities that I see, and I think the most successful is when you can think about it on the front end. That said, a lot of us on this call have workloads running already, right? So we kind of lost that opportunity to do it on the front end, and it's never too late, right? It's absolutely never too late. The ability to be able to change things in the cloud is one of the powers of it. There's so much choice between different instance families and different services that there is a good fit for your workload. And I think that's kind of where it dovetails into this partnership pillar, right? Like, are you leaning into the resources that you have both internally, right? Your various solutions architects and your developers, and externally, right? You're generally, if you're working with AWS, you have an account team, and that account team can plug you into specialists or partners like NetApp. Like, you can really connect into those resources that can amplify that trajectory. It can get you faster. Is really where I'm going.
And that's a great point, right? Partnership is key, right? And when we say partnership from when we talk about FinOps from an engineering mindset, you bring up a great point that I don't think a lot of people realizes the resources that they have, right? I go to AWS, I open up an account, you instantly unlock a number of resources that if you do a little bit of research and explore a little bit, it becomes really apparent really quick that you have so many brilliant people that work for AWS that can come in and help you figure out some of this stuff, right? We talk about optimize as being one of these pillars of that buy-in, and you just got some great tips from a senior solutions consultant telling you this is the trade-off, right? And this is how you can approach it, right? And same with requirements. You can have people identify those requirements. Your organization will have unique workload requirements. And we're not trying to say there's a one size fits all method, but when it comes to those requirements, you can have trusted advisors who come in and help you with that, and then align them to your organization's goals. And that's how you build your structure. Do you have anything that you want to add on these remaining topics before we move on?
Yeah, I think another one to think about, whether you're moving a workload over or you already have one running, is what's the business requirements.
Mhm.
I think, and those can be ever changing, right? Like, do we need high
Mhm.
availability? Do we need a disaster recovery? What's our, recovery time, recovery point? Like, thinking about those things and applying them to your workload is pretty key when you're formulating this mindset of how to run the workload and how to run it efficiently. Because oftentimes it's easy to say, okay, well, the most efficient option is just get rid of that extra region. But that might not be a great
Yeah.
business decision, right? Because if that workload were to go down for some reason or have a bug deployed, having that backup region may keep that revenue coming in, that makes the investment of keeping that in a hot state over a period of time
Mhm.
well worthwhile. So,
Mhm.
being very, very clear on that is another important key.
All right. And
Lastly, that kind of
Steve,
dovetails into.
okay.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Sean.
I was going to say, Steve asks a great question in the Q&A, and I just want to remind everybody, the Q&A, if you'll use that for your questions, it makes it so it's easier for us to see and kind of keep them in order. But Steve has a great question. He says, I'm not sure if this is true, but there are ideas that FinOps has too much dependency on hardware, thus limiting your flexibility. Are there software-defined only storage solutions? Steve, yes, there are. We're going to talk about them as we get through some of these initial FinOps topics, and we'll start talking about software storage and how you can optimize your storage in the cloud. And then another question that came up is, how do you evaluate the cost implications of scaling your cloud services to different geographic regions? That's a great question, because I think that that's one that a lot of people have on their minds right now. If I stick all my eggs in US East 1, what happens when somebody reboots the S3 stack on a February morning, and reboots half the internet, right? How do you prevent that, or how do you prepare for that resiliency? My way of approaching that to this question is to explore multi-zone first and then move to multi-region. But if you have a workload that has unique requirements where you have to keep stuff in a separate region or you have to keep it physically isolated, those trade-offs really come down to your business goals. There are cheaper places to run things based on power and energy consumption. And I want to get your take on how you advise somebody when they say, I need to think about being multi-region. What tips would you give somebody to look at?
Yeah, I think first place I usually point them to is use our pricing calculator and some of the tools that we have online to help you estimate.
Mhm.
Because you might see initially that, to your point, there are services that could be less costly to run in that region. And it also may put that workload closer to your customers, giving them more performance. So kind of taking the cost bit out of it and giving, the customer the speed that they want of pulling that resource down to what they're using. So I think there's multiple facets to look at that. And then
Mhm.
like, as I mentioned earlier, the revenue impact, right? Like, what if it were to go down? What does it cost us as a business to lose that revenue during that outage or that time period? And what would we gain by having a various setup? And then lastly, don't think of it as as a full trade-off, right? You don't have to necessarily run resources in another region in a hot state. There you can run warm, cold, like where you have stuff kind of staged that's not necessarily running yet. You can do it at different ways that meet the requirements and the comfort zone of your organization. So it doesn't have to be, necessarily a huge cost, but it might make sense to you, right? If you knew your organization was going to lose $1 million every minute or something that you're down, like it might make a ton of sense to run a hot, fully scaled, fully set up and in sync environment in another region. But if
Yep.
not, then it may not make sense. So yeah, your mileage may vary. Just a business requirement is a huge one there.
And I think it goes back to those three pillars: partnership, your unique requirements, and what the goals of your organizations are. Why are you going to the cloud in the first place? So let's talk about automation and tooling, right? There are multiple ways to do this. We have the FinOps landscape is packed with different tools that do different things. Some jump on each other. So let's define what proactive versus reactive means. Proactive means, in my mind, as a practitioner, I'm getting proactive information about my workload. I'm getting up to date, almost real, as close to real time as makes sense and is feasible information about what my environment's doing so that I can kind of gauge. And reactive is, what do I do when a threshold is hit? There are ways to discover what's running in your workload, who's sucking up too many resources. And then there are preventative tools that go in and help you build in that automation. Automation is hard to build. I can tell you, as somebody who's had to go in and put in automation to companies that have never had it before into a DevOps practice, it's just as hard for FinOps as it is for DevOps to find the right tooling and that right balance. But the benefits are real. And so let's go into how the AWS Optics team sees proactive versus reactive. And we'll just kind of work through these bullet points from your team's perspective, Adam.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, I think the proactive reactive way that I look at it is like, do we have the visibility we need? Are we getting, alerts when the bill comes and all of a sudden we see that our bill has gone up and now we got to go, dive into that to figure out where the cause is, talk to that team, figure out if it was intentional, maybe misconfiguration, or are we getting like the real-time anomalies to where we are able to react to that more quickly? Also, do we have certain signals and KPIs that we're looking at to where we can take proactive action, or that we can understand how our business is trending in a way? Are we being more efficient in our use of storage and compute? And I think like that all kind of falls into the visibility initially, the visibility perspective, and then it trends to building things to proactively take care of stuff. For example, if we know in our like dev and QA and non-prod accounts that we don't have any developers working on the weekend, that might be a great place to deploy a preventative control with an instant scheduler type of solution where it goes and automatically applies a schedule to turn off those things on the weekends where maybe somebody wouldn't have been thinking about that. So where now you're not paying for that hourly resource anymore, it's just off and it'll automatically turn back on before your developer shows up in that seat, Monday morning. So things like that are really important to think about. And it also reduces the load on those people, right? They don't even have to think anymore about turning that off when they're done with their shift. The savings are just now built in. It's doing it automatically. And I think those types of things can make proactive easy in your organization.
Well, I think the other benefit is, and you mentioned the effort, right? If I can go in and give my developers as much reduction in overhead as possible, they're not focusing on building automation that benefits us. They're working on shipping features and enhancing a product that we are collectively being asked to deliver. And so if I can free up that time by helping you build in some of this automation, I think that goes a long way. And then those benefits are all over the place, right? Like those small wins when your CEO or your CFO comes and says, we're spending too much on AWS, and you can show small victories because you've identified isolation using these automation and these tools. I think that goes a long way to building the credibility that engineering does really take, maximizing the utilization of our infrastructure and the cost that it takes to run that infrastructure at scale seriously, and increases the visibility of that partnership that I think sometimes gets lost between the business and the technical teams. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think sometimes there's a hurdle even when it comes to like developing the automation, because early on you think like, okay, well, I'll just solve this manually this one time. And then when you have to solve that one thing manually that one time now 50 times throughout the year, like the collective time you invested in that is going to be like inefficient. It's a waste. And now you're spending time doing that instead of developing features that are beneficial for the organization. And if we can avoid that, like spend a little bit of that time on the front end, solving it, not only maybe for your team, but now something that can be shared across your whole organization to other teams, like it's a multiplier really quick in the kind of effort invested versus the value that you're getting, to where you can really start to see efficiencies, at a much, much greater impact.
No, and that's a great point. And one of the things that really stuck out to me, I don't know how many of our attendees in the session were at the FinOpsX conference just last week, but the FinOps Foundation came out and basically said your tooling providers and your automation providers are here to help. They're here to make your life easier. So partner with them, right? We go back to that previous slide where we talk about partnership. Partnership doesn't just have to be with your internal business. It doesn't have to be with just your scalers. It can be with your vendors. And the more information, the more information and the more feedback and the more collaboration that you can take with your vendors who help build these automation and toolings, the better these products are going to get. Just like your product, and you guys go to and our viewers go to their customers for feedback. the feedback that you give your tooling providers makes these tools dedicated to FinOps and automating the idea of FinOps even better. There's a
Yeah, I
good
think
question
so
in the
on that.
Q&A section. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
2 things on that, Sean, real quick, while you pull that question. I think 2 of the other big benefits you get from incorporating automation is like speed to reaction, right? We don't have to worry about that person that normally manually actions that being like on vacation or having the right like on call or coverage. It's now being handled in a much more like fast and efficient manner. And then it also reduces the risk of like manual error, right? If we're doing something manually, there's still always a risk built in there that you click the wrong thing or you're in the wrong account when you do it. Like it's just human, right? All of us are prone to that. And I think with an automated system, you're programming in rules and it's going to follow those rules and take that action in a way that you've set it to. So you no longer have to think about if it's doing it in the right place. You might have to adjust a rule, right? Maybe you didn't set the rule right, but it's still going to take care of it in a predictable way.
It's all fun and games until the human clicks the wrong thing and terminates a database instance when they meant to shut it down, and they lose a 20 terabyte database. Not that that's happened to anybody that's talking right now with a black shirt on and a spot background.
We've all been there.
That's happened. Yeah, we've all been there. What is the biggest challenge you've faced in optimizing cloud performance without increasing cost? That's a question that came in from one of the viewers. I'll let you take that one away because I've got a good one.
So the biggest challenge, I guess, in increasing optimization without increasing cost, it really falls into that efficiency bucket. So I think the AI, Gen AI kind of field is probably the biggest example of that. We have these really big and performant instances with GPUs. The cost is kind of fixed in a sense because you've got this environment that you're holding on to, that you're running your training and doing different things on. And the mentality has to shift from just how can I reduce the cost? How can I get the most value out of that? And that might be monitoring the utilization of the fleet, right? How are those GPUs being utilized? Or is there any downtime? During that downtime, can we share that to another team that can also take advantage of that resource so that we're getting even more value out of that same potentially singular resource? Or can we make it a centralized thing that we can share across other teams instead of having other teams running each of their own databases as an example? Can it be a central database so we have 1 instead of 10, right? So I think looking at that perspective of getting the most value out of that resource is a great way to scale without cost necessarily being the constraint and just getting really the max bang for the buck.
Yep. No, and I would agree. Like that utilization is huge. It doesn't matter if it's storage. It doesn't matter if it's your network. It doesn't matter if it's the memory and the CPU on an instance, or even how you've set up your serverless and how you set up your autoscaler. You bring in. You mentioned the automation being key to repeatability and reducing human error. That automation. Every time that I've put in automation, I see an instant return on investment because it helps me be more proactive instead of being reactive. I'm no longer having to go out and scale out my cluster by hand. I used to pay a guy to shut down clusters at night and scale out clusters based on predicted load, because we would go and say, we know at this time a lot of people are going to be logging on. So, James, go and spin up X number of instances, and he'd come back and say, I spun them up, and now the load's decreased. Go ahead and put them down, right? And so that's inefficient. And so automation and tooling are instant trade-offs. If you don't want to go and start talking about costing and by moving workloads to spot instances, the first thing I would say is automate your cloud. The faster and better that you can automate your cloud, the more immediate cost savings you're going to get right off the bat.
I think another one, Sean, is making sure you're using the right pricing model, right? If you have a workload, and think about this from like if you're doing anything in a provisioned way, where you've deployed it and it has a set number of IOPS or a set number of capacity, you're paying for that over a fixed period of time, whether you're using it or not. And that could very well make a ton of sense if you've got a pretty consistent utilization of your tool. But if your workload is more spiky and you have like high levels of demand during a certain time of the day, and then maybe it's not used or it's very quiet at night, that's where the cloud comes in great, because you could potentially go with an on-demand type pricing model where you're just paying for that performance during the time you need it, and then it goes away, similar to your auto scaling example, right? Like it can scale down, or it can just provide the level of IOP that's needed during that time, and then it goes away. So I think as a developer, that may not be your decision to make, but I think it's important to factor into your design of do we need a provision level, or can we get by with a serverless or a on-demand type model where it'll scale according to what we need when we need it?
No, and that's a great point. And so moving on, and I see some good questions coming in that are going to be addressed as we go through. So please keep your questions coming. We love the feedback and the interaction, right? It's tech strong learning. It's not tech strong. Let me tell you about everything and talk to you. Let's have a discussion. Let's talk about operationalizing. Operationalizing is that next key, and basically think of it as continuous improvement, right? We have continuous deployment and integrations. Let's add another continuous to it and make it continuous improvement, which means visibility, standards, effort, iteration, and recognition. So let's start off with standards, and kind of these aren't in any specific order, but when we think of standards, Adam, what does standards mean to you and the AWS Optics team?
Yeah, the way I've seen standards be the most successful inside of an organization are we using things like service catalog or reference architecture or code standards, things that our organization has decided are maybe the most cost efficient, the most secure, the most performant, could factoring in maybe any type of negotiation or discount that you're getting, like using the right things at the right time and taking advantage of those standards so that each new team that wants to build something doesn't have to reinvent the wheel and think about which technologies should we use. It's in a sense standards or pre-vetted solutions that you can lean into and automatically go pick from to take advantage of. And I think when organizations get to that point, it makes, for one, development a ton faster, because you can go pick from these templates of things that are already solved and vetted, and the security hurdles have been crossed. You can deploy it and then start iterating value on top of it, and the unique customer solutions that would otherwise take a lot longer to get to, because now you're having to again figure out all the right architecture on the front end instead of just going and building. So that's the way that I look at standards, are kind of in the reference architecture code standard bucket.
Yep. And I think that that's one thing that every company that I've worked at, and I've kind of been at the mid-market, early enterprise scale, right? This is the thing they have the hardest time with. And when I have gone through and we start looking around and they say, we need to make it easier for our developers, right? We've done DevOps, we've seen benefits there, but now we're having a hard time doing the same thing with the cloud. And I always look at and say, well, why don't you do it the same way, right? You don't let developers go and pick how they're going to develop. You give them a set of standards. Every company has a software lifecycle development playbook, right, where they've gone and set the standards for their organization. And every company and I'm sure it's the same at AWS. When you join, you go through the new hire and you go, here's how you set up your machine to write code for our program. Putting those standards, or sometimes you'll hear them called guardrails, in place really do make it easier, because the less that your infrastructure, the more that your infrastructure team can focus on what they're good at, which is your infrastructure, that means the more time that your developers can focus on developing instead of picking infrastructure. And so if you can go in and preset those, you take the high effort, low value tasks away from your developers, like picking what database instance I want to run, and you give it to them. And if they need something different, then you work outside the parameters of that, and you're constantly iterating. So having that visibility is the start. Setting the standards is that second part, but then iterating and making it so it becomes effortless for people to stand up in the cloud within your parameters is another way to operationalize FinOps. You're controlling costs, but you're also controlling your infrastructure.
One thing I'd add to that, Sean, is that,
Go ahead.
and I feel this from the developer's perspective, is that know that standards can change, right? New features are released, things that may make sense to become the new standard certainly do exist, right? What makes sense today may not make sense tomorrow. So, don't necessarily feel like you have to live inside that standard or guardrail. I think it's a great starting point. But if something does change or becomes the new normal, then you might want to advocate for that new standard inside of your organization so that other teams can benefit from maybe something that they don't. So that's a place where, kind of in this operationalizing state, that it can be a flywheel where you're creating additional value by updating those standards. So that we don't get locked into an old way of thinking, right?
And keeping up with changing technology as languages change, right? We've seen it used to be the front ends were all JavaScript and kind of uniform, but now you have 18 different programming languages that you can go code up a user experience in. And so standards don't have to be hard, dedicated rules like Adam mentioned. They can be flexible, and you can adjust them to meet your product needs or just to try something new. That's the other benefit of the cloud. I think that we sometimes forget as practitioners, the cloud makes it easy for us to test. And if something breaks, go figure out why it broke. And it becomes very low states because I can go and I'm not taking over an entire server or an entire storage array. So let's talk about some use cases as an example. You mentioned CloudTrail for observability and triggering some of those rules. Let's deep dive a little bit more into these, and then we'll get some more questions and some more stories.
Yeah, so I think I had an interesting example with CloudTrail that when I was working with an organization, they had it set up, and CloudTrail, having one trail an account is free, which is an excellent way to track what's being changed and what's going on in an environment. So from kind of a governance and visibility perspective, powerful tool. But this organization that I was working with, when security took over, they deployed a CloudTrail across, like a centralized CloudTrail across all the accounts, which made a ton of sense when they did it, so that they could have centralized logging and visibility. But the second they did that, it caused the individual trails that people had set up on their accounts for their use cases to all of a sudden become a billing mechanism. They started getting charges for those CloudTrail. So, it wasn't something that in this particular example was communicated across the organization, but we've seen a bill spike. I talked with the customer at the time. They didn't have anomaly detection turned on, so they caught it at their bill rather than immediately when it happened. So we had to go retro and kind of dig in and see, okay, where did this cost come from? Figured out a new trail was created. And then we were able to communicate that across the organization to say, okay, hey, there's now a built-in trail that you can take advantage of. You can go, clear out the trail that you have. Security has deployed this, but it's one of those good examples of knowing that these environments can be large. They can be ever changing. And I think it's important that communication also is strong across the organization to when organization-wide changes happen, that we understand what the impact can be, because there can certainly be, for the better or worse, a cost impact. So that was one that we ran into that I think is important to keep in mind when you're in your environment. And it's also important to have the visibility into the cost as close to real time as possible so that you can react to them earlier rather than like having sticker shock later. And then really it becomes more efficient, right? So now we have a centralized trail that everybody's using as a source of truth so that we don't have disparate ones that may have different data.
That's a great point. I think CloudTrail often gets overlooked as not only an observability tool, but it also can help and helping fire some of those alerts and doing actions based on the trail. But I think that it can also give you some idea of where to start optimizing if you learn how to leverage it correctly. Would you agree that that's kind of one of the key tools that people should, if optimization is a big goal, the CloudTrail should be one of the places they start, or where would you tell somebody to start? I guess is a better question.
Well, I think CloudWatch is probably a better place to start because then you're getting the performance metrics of your resource. CloudTrail, though, can also be useful because if you're seeing changes being made in an environment that maybe those changes shouldn't be made, that can also be a valuable signal that things are being executed by a certain user. It can also give you that crumb of like, okay, who do I need to go talk to? Because that can be another difficult part when things are happening in an account is, okay, who's the owner or who's the person making these changes? I'd like to find out if these changes are expected or fraud. And you can go after like talking to the right people. And that's where those two go hand in hand.
S3 Glacier Lifecycle is an interesting one. Probably one of my favorites, not only because I'm a storage guy, but I think people get really hung up on what its core benefit is. So let's talk about S3 Glacier Lifecycle and how you've seen it work, and then I'll jump in with a story about how I've seen it work.
Yeah, so one of the great benefits of S3 in general is that you are paying for what you use, not what you provision, right? So if you have, a SAN or something that you've bought in a physical environment, you bought the amount of storage that you think you might need in the future. Great part about S3 is you're only paying for the quantity or the gigs that you're storing, and that only. Inside of S3, though, we have different storage tiers, and the farther you push it down into those colder tiers, the less you pay per gig, but then the more you start paying to request or to pull that data. Because the idea is you shouldn't really be accessing that data a lot, and it becomes a big savings to keep that data in those colder tiers. I think the area in this particular example where I've seen a customer run into issues is that they were just quickly saying, okay, Glacier's cheaper per gig. I'm just going to move a bunch of stuff into Glacier. You have to do an evaluation, first of all, to make sense. Like how many objects, how big are the objects, how often are we going to be accessing them? And there's a payback period there. Like when you move stuff downstream that we'll get the savings after a certain period of time of it being there and you've transitioned it into that class. And in this particular example, a customer moved a lot of small objects over, which have a longer payback period. Generally, the bigger the object and the less quantity of objects, the quicker you get that value for it being in a more cold tier. Whereas vice versa, if you have a lot of small objects, the longer it takes to recoup that cost, because there was cost with having to basically move it to those archive tiers. It'd be like moving it to tapes and other things, right? So I think it's important to evaluate, making sure you're putting the things that you're storing in the right class, right? Do we truly need all of this log data for, readily accessible at a moment's notice to get, or is it just something that we might have to audit in the case of a unique environment? If it's something that we only need to audit very, very infrequently, let's, create a policy and move that down to a tier where we're paying less for it, or maybe deleting it altogether, right?
Yep. And automating it, right? Like somebody doesn't have to go delete that bucket when doesn't need to be used anymore, right? For me, S3 and the life cycle comes into play for the archiving, but also just for the time to serve, right? If you have a bunch of small objects, like you said, and you put it on the wrong tier and it takes forever for your stuff to get back, you're not being efficient. So using the automation, the S3 team has worked really hard over the last 36 months to really make that tiering more effective and more intuitive, right? Including the automation of what to do with it after it's hit that threshold. Do I call it back up? Do I delete it? Do I archive it? What are we doing? When you start looking at I've always told people storage is the first place I look for savings. When I'm wanting to optimize infrastructure, I look at storage first, because there's so much over provisioned and so many services that call storage that you wouldn't think call storage, like the AWS backup service, right? If you set up AWS backup wrong, you're going to waste a lot of money keeping data hot that doesn't need to be hot, or putting it in the wrong tier and having to call it back during a crisis. So I think they've made it. I think leveraging the intuitiveness and the way that the AWS team goes to make things easy for the practitioner. Right? Nobody not only from a console experience, but also from a CLI experience and a tooling experience, making it so it's easier for the practitioner to actually do some of those tasks and understand what the impacts are going to be is where I see a lot of the benefit. And S3 is a perfect example of that. These last two kind of go together, the data transfer misconfiguration and modernizing managed services. So let's break those down, what those mean to the optics team and how they help with the financial controls and the FinOps challenges of an AWS customer.
Yeah, I think data transfer is important to think about, because it's kind of the plumbing. It's how the communication happens between all the things that you're running. And an example that I guess occurred where I seen kind of an inefficient use case was, developer pushed something and it changed a route, and data that was supposed to be staying internal, talking, between two services, was now going out the internet. And data going out of the internet is a lot more expensive than data that you keep internally. Also a lot less secure if it's going out and then kind of coming back in. And I think it's important to think about and understand those flows and monitor those types of things so that you can react to it. And to your point of it kind of tying in with managed services, like the more you're using managed services, it's like a solution in a box, right? It's already kind of got that part figured out so that you're not having to do, in some cases, as much of the routing. You're not having to understand some of that complexity of where it should go. It's now going to be a lot easier to deploy. And I guess an example that I've seen where customers take advantage of modernizing their workloads are things that require very low effort, virtually give you the same performance, sometimes more performance, like we have Graviton, for example, in a managed services RDS. If you're running RDS and the underlying instance is not Graviton, it's a good thing to go evaluate and find out if the database type that you're running and the version that you're on can go to Graviton, because under the hood, you could change that to a Graviton type instance and start saving like 10% with little to no effort and likely more performance for that database. So modernizing managed services is one of the kind of best kept secrets of like low effort, high value that you could go after, similar with Lambda and some of our other services out there. So if you're not already looking at that, those of you on here, I can encourage you to start taking a look at that.
Yeah, definitely. And to back up on that, right? Graviton is really easy if you're using RDS, Graviton is really easy because you can go spin up and add a Graviton instance to your cluster hot, and move everything around without impacting a production workload and start realizing savings, right? And you'll get feedback really quick if it's going to work or not. But I always look at the managed services and the advanced services that AWS specifically offers as a trusted advisor. Cloud professionals, infrastructure professionals, DevOps teams, SREs, they're expensive. If you're not at the point where you can go and justify that full-time Postgres DBA that can help tune your database, leverage your partners, right? We go back to that partners slide that we had earlier. Leverage your partners and let them help you realize some of those benefits for your workload. So again, you can focus on what works for your organization. So let's talk about Spot. We've gone through this. I'm going to kind of run through Spot, and then we've got a lot of good questions, and so I want to make sure that we get through it. But where does Spot fit into the NetApp solution portfolio? We talk about storage infrastructure and data services, and you see cloud services over here on the far right. But customer initiatives are all similar at the end of the day. You want to modernize and extend your data center to the cloud for resiliency. You want to be able to migrate and run your workloads in the cloud. You want to have the governance and be able to protect your environments no matter where it sits. You want to be able to see it, and you want to automate and optimize. NetApp, all of these little pillars that you see here, going over to the cloud provider, these 5 pillars are all things that NetApp can handle with our Cloud Ops portfolio. So what is Spot by NetApp? We automate cloud infrastructure orchestration, ensuring that you're expanding the use of excess compute or Spot instances of AWS, but making sure that you're getting the best value per compute unit. And we'll define that here in a second. We also want to help you reduce your cloud operation burden. We want to use application-driven auto-scaling to meet your workload needs, which means we're watching your workload. We're not watching somebody else's workload to make the decision. We're watching your workload and your metrics that are coming through. And we want to accelerate your application delivery, because the faster that you can get your product out, the more successful you are, which gives that continuous optimization as part of your as part of your software lifecycle. So what does Spot by NetApp do now that we know who they are? We do application management. We can help you ensure that your infrastructure is optimized at deployment. We can help you manage your open source database tools. We can help you with data processing speed and machine learning as you're training models. We can help you optimize your infrastructure, from containers to virtual machines to networking to storage to the incoming connections through your API. Our tools can, in the Spot portfolio specifically, can come in and address all of these, while having another tool that can come in and help with cost management, giving you observability into what your spend is, helping you build workflows and keep your security, governance, and compliance efforts in check. Basically, at the end of the day, we meet you where you are on your cloud ops journey. We're an AWS Premier Partner. We're a FinOps Foundation member, and we're a FinOps certified platform. And last week, we were introduced as one of the first tools on the market that is FinOps Focus certified. We're going to talk about FinOps Focus here in a second, and go into what that means from an operational perspective. But really, the challenge that we're addressing is the inefficiency. Container-based applications, at the end of the day, use under 60% of the requested CPU and memory on average. That's a lot of memory and a lot of CPU that you could get some use out of. And by using Spot by NetApp's tools, we see that efficiency, that utilization go from under 60% to over 95% without impacting the performance of your workload. There are 3 ways to purchase your infrastructure. We can do it the most expensive way, on demand or pay-go. We scale up and down based on demand, but it's the most expensive way. We can go to AWS and do committed capacity, where we buy reserved instances and savings plans. More affordable, but it's less flexible, because you're committing to future use that you may not have forecasting into. And then there's 3, the most risky and the cheapest, right? We can use those Spot instances. We have customers that run workloads on Spot instances exclusively. It's the lowest cost option, but there's no SLA, and they can be taken away at any moment. So what if there was a tool that could do this, that could help you use that blend of Spot, reserved instances, and on demand as necessary to save 70 to 90% of your workload costs, while ensuring that we're meeting your committed usage discounts. So we're basically helping you with that forecasting aspect while matching your infrastructure to your demands and using AI and machine learning behind the scenes to drive that infrastructure optimization without your engineers having to touch it. The magic of Spot, because we've been doing this for almost 10 years, we are able to go in and predict that availability for that excess capacity or those Spot instances. And so we can take your interruptions way down by using our AI and machine learning and the data that we have from the Spot marketplace to predict the virtual machine or the instance behavior, the trends for that instance family, the pricing, and how often it's going to be interrupted. Making sure that, and then when we predict that it's going to be interrupted, we can start proactively moving your workload around without impacting your workload, ensuring that your customers don't have, and your workloads don't have that experience interrupted. Basically, you can run containers without managing servers using Spot by NetApp. We can handle by working with us, we can handle the infrastructure, the provisioning, and the price acquisition, no matter what control plane you're using or what data plane you're using. And we can even do it based on how your pods inside of your containers are going. So if we can go and watch your workload and we can say, hey, you've got 4XL instances that you're using at this capacity, but we could go to 8X large and put every single pod on it and still get that same performance, we're going to move you to that because it's going to be cheaper at the end of the day than 4 instances versus 1. And we use that advanced AI and ML data that we have from over 10 years of doing this to continuously, behind the scenes, right size your pods and your nodes. So the key takeaways before we get into the question and answers: number one, incorporate FinOps into your cloud ops and development lifecycles rather than treating cost and usage as a different topic altogether. Make sure that your development teams, your product teams, your infrastructure teams are all working together on the same page. Number two, leverage tooling. Spot by NetApp builds tools purpose-built in partnership with AWS and separately to handle cloud ops and FinOps automation, commitment management, and optimization of your workloads at all aspects. As we said, your infrastructure, your storage, your network, all of that is taken into account. And third, and finally, continuous optimization is just as important as continuous integration and continuous delivery are to your cloud ops and DevOps. FinOps is a journey, not a destination. And you need to continuously optimize to get the best results from your workloads. Is there anything that I missed or that you'd like to add, Adam, before we get into the questions and answers?
I think you covered it well. I think the perspective of it would be something difficult to do to be able to run things on demand and kind of augment that with Spot. But leveraging automation and tooling that can do that for you, you kind of get the best of both worlds. You have an on-demand workload that is covering maybe the core business and services that you're running, but then maybe some of the peak and things are captured with those way more cost-efficient Spot workloads. So Spot can be a huge asset in a lot of organizations when you can fit it in a way that's easy.
All right, that's a great point and a great way to enter into our Q&A section. We'll have Amanda help us out and read some of the questions, and we'll tag team back and forth. What do you say, Adam?
Sounds great. Look forward to it.
That Perfect. Works. And if there's any that may have been slightly covered, my apologies. I'm just going to start at the top of our Q&A and we're going to work down. If you've got more questions, please get them in. We try and utilize the most amount of time with Sean and Adam so that we can get your questions answered. First one at the top that I have are, what are some of the best practices for optimizing cloud costs without compromising performance? Rapid fire.
I'll let you take that one, Adam.
Yeah, I think we touched on that a little bit. But to recap briefly, it's getting the most value out of the resources that you have in the cloud to make sure that you're getting max performance rather than partial performance in a sense for the cost. That ensures that just kind of bang for buck or KPI or unit cost that you're being efficient.
Yeah.
I say start looking for dead or idle instances, right? Like how many of us have left a VM on because we were doing something, we got pulled away, and we just forgot about it? I know I have for 3 months. And then you go, what did I send that up for? I don't remember. It doesn't have the tags. It doesn't have anything that I need on it. So I'm just going to kill it. And putting those strategies together, and you'll hear a lot about FinOps, use tagging, use object classification. That really does help when you're doing an at-a-glance view. If it doesn't have all the right tags, kill it. But you can also put that into your standards and use your automation tools to say, if it doesn't meet these roles and it's not been accessed or I'm not using it, delete it. Why am I paying for it if I'm not using it, right? And so finding those resources that are stale or forgotten about, that's the key to start optimizing without impacting performance for me.
Great.
One other that you could do is commitments, I guess I would add, right? If there's a subset of your workload that sticks around and is going to be around for at least the next year, like there are generally RI savings plan type of commitment options to where for the same resources that you're running, you can save a considerable amount. So understand where it'll make sense to layer in a commitment.
That's a great tip that I don't think we talk about enough as practitioners, is the importance of identifying the logistics around commitment acquisition. That I think that we could talk a lot more about, but that could be a whole webinar on itself. I'll let you go ahead with the next question, Amanda.
Okay, no problem. Trust me, I'm letting you both go. I think this is a good one. Can you share an example where AI-driven automation significantly reduced your cloud costs while maintaining or improving performance? The topic of the year, AI.
Yeah, I mean, I see it all the time, right? I see it in our customer environments. I see it when they can go scale a Kubernetes cluster as high as they need for a point in time, and the AI just does it for them. It's no longer where you have to set up a war room because your network's down. The other place where I've seen it is when it comes to determining what you're going to do with, we talk about these committed usage discounts. If you're a ticket company, without mentioning customer names, right? If you're a concert ticketing company and you have a bunch of instances that and savings plans and commitments that you've made to your hyperscaler, and a pandemic happens and you can no longer sell tickets, what are you going to do with all this capacity? If you could use AI to go and help you offload some of that and move it to a online gaming company that everybody's hopping on and playing because they're all at home, right? That's where the AI really comes into it. You no longer have to sit there and go and manage the shutdown and transferring of those instances. AI, and I bring this up because AWS has the RI marketplace where I can go and trade or sell off RIs that I no longer have a use for. That became really big during the pandemic, and the automation, I think, is really what enabled people to do that super fast and allow businesses to scale in a way we haven't seen before. Zoom's another example, right? Where they were able to rapidly scale up their backend infrastructure by using automation to acquire some of these instances and compute resources that they needed instantly in those early days of the pandemic to make their application scale. What about you, Adam? What are your thoughts?
I think another one that you kind of touched on that we have on the AWS side is like predictive auto scaling. So in that case, it uses AI to try to understand the patterns of traffic that you have and to scale proactively. I think that helps not only from cost, but also for performance, so that you're not trying to scale as like the CPU is getting pegged and you're risking potential performance gaps. It sees those kind of patterns in history of what you're getting normally for users, and it may scale proactively to kind of meet the cost and performance constraints. And then on the flip side, another one that's more cost oriented with AI is things like anomaly detection. I think that gives you not necessarily a cost optimization, but a cost avoidance mechanism, which ultimately ends up being a way to save, where you can detect a cost spike that is out of the ordinary or appears to be out of the ordinary, so that you can look into it more quickly rather than having it be a surprise when the bill comes in.
That's a fair point. And if you want to see it in action, you can visit spot.io to sign up for a demo, and we can show you what it looks like in action. Because our demo, when you take a demo from one of our AEs or one of our solutions architects, you go in and you can see how the Spot platform uses this AI and machine learning to drive running our production workloads on Spot instances and see how it works behind the scenes.
Great. All right. I would add more questions, but I want to be respectful for everybody's time. So
yeah, I'm wondering if we should answer these separately and send them out as a resource, because these are some really good questions that I'm seeing in here.
Yeah, absolutely. And just for everybody, before we close out today's program, we do have downloads available. They'll be on the resources page at the bottom left. Feel free to download them. And we also have the survey there, as your input about today's session is invaluable to us. And if there's any other topics that you'd like to hear from AWS and Spot by NetApp in the future, that would be the perfect place to do so. Let us know your thoughts. We want to hear them. Once again, this program has been recorded as well. You will receive an email shortly after we conclude today's session in order to view it. If we didn't get to all of your questions, our apologies. We only have so much time. But I do want to take the time also to thank Sean and Adam for their time, sharing their knowledge, their expertise with us today. And it's been such a pleasure having both of you, for sure.
Thank you so much for having us. And I'll just throw out there for me, as we wrap this up, please feel free to add me on LinkedIn. I mean, easy to find. Happy to make introductions and answer some of these other questions because there were some good ones and would love to talk more about it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, same's true for me. I think my goal with attending these types of things is to advocate and share as much knowledge as possible. Right, only one person working with a small set of customers. This is a great opportunity to share that knowledge more broadly, so that I hope you can achieve those efficiencies in your environment.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, thank you to both of you, and thank you all of you for joining us in this TechStrong learning experience today. And I'm going to conclude now, and I hope you all have a good rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Great
Bye-bye.
week, everyone.